Around 30,000 years ago, something strange started happening to human beings. For the first time, old people became common. Not a few survivors. Enough of them that almost every group had one. And the moment that happened, everything about us accelerated. Which is strange, because by every rule of survival, an old human should have been the most useless thing in the camp. Too slow to hunt, too weak to carry, too old to have children. A mouth that eats without producing anything. In any other species, that animal dies. In ours, that animal became the single most valuable thing the group owned. This is the story of how being useless turned out to be the most important thing that ever happened to us. First, let's kill a number you have definitely heard. That prehistoric humans had a life expectancy of about 30 years. It is technically true. It is also one of the most misleading statistics in all of human history. Because life expectancy is an average, and averages get destroyed by what happens at the very beginning of life. In a world without antibiotics, clean water, or midwives, an enormous share of babies never reach their 5th birthday. Drop enough zeros and ones into a set of numbers, and the average collapses, even if the survivors live long lives. So the 30 is real. It just does not describe a single actual person. Almost nobody died at 30. Here is the number that actually matters. If you survive childhood, your odds change completely. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups suggest that people who reached 15 often had a realistic chance of reaching 60 or 70. These are not our ancestors, and the comparison has limits, but it is the closest window we have into that world. So the picture flips. Prehistory was not a world where everyone died young. It was a world where childhood was lethal. And if you got through that gate, you could live long enough to watch your own grandchildren learn to walk. But surviving is not the same as thriving. Living to 60 in the Stone Age was not living to 60 today. There were no glasses, no painkillers, no dentists, no hip replacements. Your body simply wore out in front of you. And the first thing to go, almost always, was your teeth. Prehistoric food was tough. Roots, fibrous plants, dried meat, and grit from the stones used to grind it. Chew that for 40 years, and your molars flattened down like worn tires, sometimes right through to the nerve. Archaeologists find skulls with teeth ground almost to the gum, and jaws showing signs of long-running infection. A tooth infection you cannot treat does not stay in your mouth. It spreads. Sometimes it kills you. So one of the quietest killers in prehistory was something you deal with today by making an appointment. Then there were the joints. Every winter, every long walk, every carried child left a mark that never healed. Arthritis shows up constantly in old skeletons. Knees, hips, spines worn in ways that would have made every morning hurt. Your eyes went too. Without lenses, the world simply blurred at the edges and then kept closing in. And your hearing, which in a world where a snapped twig might be a predator, was not a small problem. So picture the reality. You are 50. You cannot run down an animal. You cannot see the horizon clearly. You cannot chew the food you helped find. Every night your hips ache, and you eat as much as a hunter. In a group living close to the edge, that arithmetic is brutal. You cost more than you bring in. And yet, over and over, we find skeletons of people who lived years past the point of being able to feed themselves. Which means somebody was feeding them. Somebody carried them. Somebody softened their food and waited for them on the walk. That is not a small detail. That is a species making a decision. Because keeping an unproductive adult alive through a hard winter is a cost you pay in other people's food. Every group that did it was choosing to be a little hungrier so that someone slow could keep walking with them. The obvious explanation is love, and that is probably part of it. But love does not survive a famine on its own. In a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar, archaeologists found a Neanderthal man who makes the point better than any argument. He was old by the standards of his world, and his skeleton is a list of catastrophes. A crushing blow to the left side of his face, severe enough that he was probably blind in that eye. A withered right arm, which appears to have been useless, and by some readings was amputated below the elbow. Damage to his leg and foot that would have made every step painful and slow. Here is the part that matters. All of those injuries show signs of healing. He did not die from them. He lived for years afterwards, half-blind, one-armed, limping in a world that did not owe anyone anything. There's only one way that happens. Other people kept him alive. Researchers argue about how much to read into a single skeleton, and they are right to argue. Maybe he was cared for out of affection. Maybe he was still useful in ways bones cannot record. But either way, he survived. And a group that lets a man like that survive is doing something no other animal does. And Shanidar is not alone. Across the record, we find people who lived long past the point of self-sufficiency. Which brings us to the question that actually explains all of it. What are these people for? Because there's a reason keeping them was worth the food, and it has almost nothing to do with kindness. Try to imagine a world with no writing. Not bad writing. None. Zero external storage of any kind. Everything your group knows exists in exactly one place. Inside living heads. That is the entire library. And when one of those heads stops working, that information is gone. Permanently. There is no backup. Now think about which knowledge actually decides whether your group lives or dies. It is not the everyday stuff. Everyone knows how to make a fire. Everyone knows where the river is in summer. The knowledge that saves you is the knowledge about the year everything goes wrong. Whereas water, when the river dries up completely, that happens maybe once in 40 years. Which plant can you eat when the usual ones fail? And which one that looks identical will kill you? Where did the herds go the last time the winter came early? Nobody under 40 was alive to see it. A young hunter carries strength. An old person carries the last time this happened. And rare events are exactly the ones that end groups. Not the ordinary year, the unprecedented one. So the oldest person in your camp was not a burden with a memory. They were a database of catastrophes. And we have hints of just how far this kind of memory can travel. Some researchers argue that certain Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describe coastlines that flooded thousands of years ago. The claim is debated, and it should be, but if it holds, it means a story survived hundreds of generations intact. Passed mouth to mouth from old to young, over and over, with no writing anywhere in the chain. That is what an old human was in a world without books. Not a person who used to be useful. A person carrying the only copy of information that nobody else in the world still had. But memory is only half the story. The other half is stranger, and it is about women. Because there is something about human females that almost no other animal on Earth does. In nearly every species, females reproduce until close to the end of their lives. Fertility and death arrive together. Human women stop decades early, and then keep living, often for another 20 or 30 years. From a purely evolutionary point of view, that is close to nonsense. Those are decades of upkeep with no offspring. Almost the only other animals that do anything similar are certain whales. Orcas, most famously. And in orcapods, older females turn out to lead. They know where the salmon are in the bad years. Which start to sound familiar. So what were human grandmothers doing with those extra decades? Anthropologists working with the Hadza in Tanzania noticed something that had been sitting in plain sight. The hardest working foragers in the camp were often not the young mothers. They were the older women, out for hours, digging deep tubers out of hard ground and bringing back more than they ate themselves. That surplus went to grandchildren, which quietly solves a problem that should have made humans impossible. Human children stay dependent for an absurdly long time. Years after weaning, they still cannot feed themselves. In most animals, a mother cannot start the next baby until the last one is independent. That should slow us down badly. But if a grandmother feeds the older child, the mother is free to have the next one sooner. More children, closer together, all still fed. That is not a small advantage. That is a different species trajectory. This is called the grandmother hypothesis, and it is a hypothesis. Serious researchers still argue about it. But it turns menopause from a biological failure into something that looks a lot more like a strategy. Now, put the two halves together and look at what happened around 30,000 years ago. One study of fossil teeth compared how many individuals reached grandparent age across different periods of human history. And in the Upper Paleolithic, that number jumps sharply. Suddenly, there are far more old people than before. And that jump sits right next to one of the strangest bursts of creativity in our entire record. Cave painting, carved figures, better tools, ornaments, burial with objects, culture appearing almost everywhere at once. Two things happening at the same time is not proof that one caused the other, and nobody can prove this one. But it is very hard to build a culture when everyone who knows anything dies before they can finish teaching it. Human beings did not get further ahead than every other animal because we were stronger or faster. We were neither. We got ahead because at some point we started keeping the people who could no longer run and listening to them instead.